when we were doing this arrangement, at first there were talks about rights over natural resources, rights over harvesting, all of those normal conversations. But at one point, I was reminded quite clearly. I think this was Tim that we always talk about natural resources and harvesting, and you guys never talk about culture, and it always gets put on the back burner. And in some aspects, I think that was right. I think that was right. Where people were busy talking about the other Section 35 rights and weren't thinking about the fact that Mi'kmaq have rights over their culture. When someone is depicting Mi'kmaq culture, when somebody is using Mi'kmaq language, when somebody is telling a Mi'kmaq story, Mi'kmaq have rights to do that properly. Nobody should be doing those things for them. They should be the ones telling those. They should be the ones depicting that. They should be the ones developing programs and protocols on how their language will become an integral part of parks. So that's why we made sure we created within the arrangement the fact that rights are not just to resources, rights are to culture and language and self-determining who you are. Second of all, concern over the protection of sacred sites and burial sites within national parks and historic sites. We know within the existing parks and historic sites in Nova Scotia, there are Mi'kmaq burial sites which are identified. We need to ensure that those sites are given the proper protection, honor, and respect that they're due. Within the arrangement, we talk about utilizing the Assembly's protocol on burial sites, burial remains, and burial artifacts to ensure that if any articles are found that are associated with burials, the Mi'kmaq have their own process and their own ways of looking at it to ensure things are done properly. We also have a system in place where if sacred sites or burial sites are identified, the co-management board can go in camera and have discussions over sacred sites and burial sites so that those aren't public, so that those can be kept private and away from others that might be going to them, that those can be identified and that proper protection and implementation plans can be put in place for those areas. Because we know one thing as well is we don't want to simply protect off these sites because we want to make them available to Mi'kmaq if they wish to pay respects and honor these places. So how do we make sure that we have a system where these places are private, where these places are protected, but these places are also accessible for Mi'kmaq for their interactions with their ancestors and their interactions with their culture? We're putting in protocols for the use of parks for community events. Sometimes we know that when communities want to do events in a national park, they don't necessarily want to do them in full public. They would like to have a private setting where they can do their community events. And so now within the park will be set up scenarios where communities can work with parks to have areas cordoned off so that they can have their ceremonies and events privately. And as the Earthkeeper showed, the use of parks for youth and elder camps, piloting the one in Kejimkujik at this point, would like to see youth and elder camps also set up in all the other parks and historic sites so that we can start interacting youth and elders on the land at the same sites. All Indigenous sites and objects will be deemed to be Mi'kmaq unless there's proof otherwise. One of the problems we had in the past is oftentimes Indigenous artifacts were found, and you would have archaeologists or others argue about whether these things were Mi'kmaq, not Mi'kmaq, could we tell, or whatever. We're getting rid of that. If it's an Indigenous artifact, we will deem that artifact to be a Mi'kmaq artifact. If there's some sort of evidence that shows us that they could be Mohawk, they could be others, then we will work with the other indigenous nation on how to deal with their artifacts in the way they see fit, to make sure that we're being respectful. But we don't want to start having arguments with people about whether something is Mi'kmaq or not Mi'kmaq. Development of agreements and protocols around repatriation, custody, and decision-making for Mi'kmaq objects. No Mi'kmaq artifacts will leave Mi'kma'ki. So in the past, when Parks Canada had custody and control of Mi'kmaq artifacts, oftentimes those artifacts could be taken to Ottawa or elsewhere. And in fact, we have a place in Dartmouth now that is holding a number of Mi'kmaq artifacts from Parks Canada that they have threatened to close down at any number of times. So within this agreement, Parks is agreeing that none of those artifacts will ever leave Mi'kma'ki. So they have to work with you on how those artifacts stay in the land with the people that they're from. Repatriation is an important question. And we need to start talking about how the Mi'kmaq begin reclaiming custody of things that belong to the ancestors of the Mi'kmaq. How do the Mi'kmaq start looking at those objects, ethnographic objects, that are important to bring back to communities and back to people to understand their heritage and understand where they came from. And we've had some really good examples of how that is starting to happen. I know I was talking to Heather Stevens at Millbrook about the repatriation of the regalia from Australia back to Millbrook. These are incredibly positive examples of how Mi'kmaq are getting their heritage and their culture back. So we need to talk and create protocols with parks so that we can create a systemic and clear way in which parks will start doing this with Mi'kmaq communities. And it has to be done in conjunction with Mi'kmaq. At this point, the problem is we don't know where we would put a number of the objects. We don't want to do anything that would lead to the destruction of any of the objects. So how do we work with parks to make sure that it's done in a way and in timing that leads to the protection of the objects for the Mi'kmaq? Archaeology stewardship plan will be created to create research and fieldwork. This is really what Heather was talking about in her presentation. How do we make sure that any archaeological work that's done in parks and historic sites are done with the full consent and understanding of the Mi'kmaq going forward? And how do we make sure that Mi'kmaq participate in those projects to learn about how the land was used, to learn about what their ancestors were doing, and to provide the proper ceremony and respect to the work that's being done. Development and updating of information of all known artifacts and objects. What we want to do is start creating a listing of all of the objects that are Mi'kmaq that Parks Canada has, and making sure we understand where they are and making sure that they're being taken care of properly as we go forward. Finally, I want to get to the section on economic opportunities that are in the arrangement. In the arrangement, Parks Canada is agreeing to set priorities on contracting opportunities for Mi'kmaq within national parks and historic sites. So parks and historic sites do a number of things where they privately contract, be it construction work, be it catering, be it snowplow work, any of those type of things. And we are looking for priorities being set on Mi'kmaq businesses that could provide those services. So one of the first things we'll be doing is the co-management board will start developing a listing of Mi'kmaq businesses and Mi'kmaq contracting services, and how do we work with those businesses and contracting services to make sure that they're not bid out of a number of things that happen with the federal government. Oftentimes, contractors are asked to have a certain amount of bonding or a certain amount of money that they put down in order to get the contracts, which often precludes Mi'kmaq from being able to get involved with that. How do we change those rules so that Mi'kmaq have access to them without being without having the glass ceiling just squeeze them out. Number two, business opportunities. And the difference between contracting and business opportunities is one of the things that Parks is interested in discussing with Mi'kmaq going forward is the idea of retailing possibilities within park sites. So we have crafters who work within the communities, developing crafts, looking for places to sell the crafts. Parks is interested in saying, what if we had craft outlets available in all the parks and national historic sites? What if we had Mi'kmaq shops which were selling Mi'kmaq books, Mi'kmaq crafts, Mi'kmaq developed business opportunities, which is why it's exciting with the work that you guys have been doing as chiefs and councils on Mi'kmaq Widazik and identifying Mi'kmaq identification of crafts and so forth, because that will find its place within parks. And if you remember, a place like Citadel Hill, excuse me, a place like Citadel Hill will get literally over 1 million visitors a year. And so that provides an opportunity for crafts producers and others to have an availability of a market like that they don't have at this point. And finally, career opportunities for Mi'kmaq. In the past, there's been a growing connection of parks to hiring Mi'kmaq for various aspects of things. Unfortunately, in the past, oftentimes those were seasonal. Oftentimes they were for 1 month or 2 months at a national park, and the ability to promote up through the system has been difficult for Mi'kmaq going forward. Parks Canada is going to put emphasis on starting to get Mi'kmaq within the park system and getting Mi'kmaq up into positions of management within the parks system in the area. So like I said, I would love to see it that in the next 4, 5, 6 years, we started seeing Mi'kmaq park managers, Mi'kmaq park stewards, Mi'kmaq field unit superintendents, who were all in charge of the park and National Historic Site assets in Nova Scotia. Finally, under the arrangement, it's going to be up to the Doki Malioptimuk Board to monitor and evaluate the arrangement, make any required recommendations to the Assembly and to the Minister on how the arrangement's working, or if they want to see changes, or how they want it to go. The Assembly and the Minister can instruct the Board to address any issues concerning the arrangement or parks management in general. So it may be a situation where the issue is not coming from the Board to you, but you have an issue that you want to bring to the Board. That's available so that the Board will look at it. And finally, working with Parks Canada on implementation dollars for the implementation of the arrangement. So what would happen is, as soon as we know that we have an arrangement, we'd be sitting down with groups like CMM and UINR and others to figure out what is it going to take to implement the parts of the arrangement in the way that we want to do it. The funding is simply grant funding, so it doesn't come with any strings on what the money has to be used for, other than meeting what we want to meet in the parks understanding. So if we want to put the money to different projects, different programs, different initiatives, that's fully up to the Mi'kmaq to figure out how they want to do that and put it forward with themselves. And they wouldn't need any sort of approvals on funding for that from Parks Canada going forward. So where we're at is, as I said, we've got sample BCRs that I've got hard copies, but we'll also be sending out electronic copies to each of the communities. I encourage chiefs and councils to talk it over. If there's any questions, by all means, let me know. If you want me to come down and talk about some things, by all means, let me know. Parks Canada is taking this arrangement through their system as well, so that they get approvals. I know in PEI, I believe the two communities have already approved their arrangement. New Brunswick's currently in the same part of the process we are. I'm hopeful. They tell me, and how they know, I don't know, but they tell me that they think this government may last till December before it blows up. And so that's what I'm pushing for, is to make sure that we can get the work we need to get done before we have federal elections and new governments and what have you. So over the next week or so, I'll be certainly will be contacting you from our office with the electronic copy of the BCR. What the BCR simply says is that the council approves their chief ratifying the arrangement on their behalf. And so we'll be sending that around. We're hoping that we can get it signed up and ready to go. If so, the arrangement will be ready to put into place April 1st, 2025. So the next fiscal year, we'll start putting all of this into place. The co-management board will be created. The technical groups will be created. Stewardship plans will be in place, and we'll move forward from there.